a pretty messy one, to be clear, because we're down to just 6 games now because we lost the Detroit and Pittsburgh game, and that's a dicey situation because we were already in a rough spot. There were a lot of games with some bad weather situations. There weren't a lot of good pitchers on the slate. And it's not like the Detroit and Pittsburgh guys were great to begin with, but we're down to 6 games now. Most of them have some sort of weather concern, whether it be temperature or potentially rain. We're going to have to dig a bit to try to find some good options for today. Also, just not the best pitching options. So we're going to do that right now. Get you set for a slate that could be messy, but if it's messy for us, it's messy for everyone else too. So let's dive on in and try to win some money tonight. Welcome on into the Solo Shot. That's right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and numberFire.com. My name is Jim Sonis. I am a senior writer and analyst for numberFire.com, here to get you set for tonight's 6-game slate. And it is going to lock at 6-10. So if you are like me and tend to procrastinate with filling out lineups, getting those entries in, make sure you are done by 6:10 tonight, which is when we have first pitch of the first game. 3 games in that 6 o'clock hour, 2 in the 7 o'clock hour, 1 at 8 p.m. So again, 6:10 lock for tonight. Make sure you are prepared for that. And it will be crucial to be available around then because, as mentioned, there is a lot of rough weather for today. First one is out in Cleveland. It is just 38 degrees as they're hosting the White Sox. So you downgrade hitters there. There's a chance of rain in New York for the Yankees and the Braves, though it looks like the rain will be moving out around first pitch. So I'd bet they're good to play there. It's a similar situation in Cincinnati for the Diamondbacks and the Reds. They will also be concluding last night's suspended game beforehand. So I think that starts at 5:10, which means lineups for this game might be late and potentially might be after lock, especially if they had to start that suspended game later. That could lead to a rough situation. So be cognizant of that for today. Rain is likely in Boston for the Red Sox and the Blue Jays, though it appears light. It is still a risk, but it's at least light. So it's not a lock to get rained out, but I would definitely be aware of that for sure. Finally, it is 40 degrees in Chicago for the Mets and the Cubs. So downgrade hitters there. The warmest game on this slate is actually the one in Boston at 56 degrees. So that means that 38 degrees, not as much of a downgrade as it usually would be, just because there aren't a ton of alternatives. However, it's still 20 degrees colder there than it is in Boston, still 15 degrees colder there than it is in New York. So still a downgrade. It's not as big of a downgrade as it usually would be. We should have a better grasp on what the weather looks like for today, what things are going to be moved around for the afternoon stream. As always, that is at 4 p.m. Eastern on the FanDuel YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, and Twitter pages. Make sure you are subscribed there. Make sure you tune in at 4 p.m. Eastern to get your questions in and ask about today's slate. And again, probably extra critical for today, just given there could be a lot of moving pieces with the weather situation being what it is. So I'd recommend tuning back in 4 p.m. today. We'll try to get full thoughts in for the slate before then, though, so you can have an idea of what we're thinking for today's slate. Before that, though, what's going on, sports fans? FanDuel Sportsbook has a special offer for you this spring season. Same-game parlays allow viewers to bet on any NBA, MLB, or soccer game. Place a 4+ leg parlay on any game across those 3 sports. If exactly one leg loses, you will receive a refund credit on the site of $25. Come get involved in the action and place a same-game parlay at FanDuel Sportsbook. Must be 21 plus and present in Colorado, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. Refund issued as a non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 7 days. Max refund $25. Terms apply. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. In Iowa, 1-800-BETS-OFF. In Indiana, 1-800-9-WITH-IT. In Michigan, for confidential help, call 1-800-270-7117. In Tennessee, call the Red Line at 1-800-889-9789. Or in West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. Pitching preview, it's a grim one for this Wednesday slate. Aaron Savali is the highest salary pitcher on FanDuel. He checks in at $10,200. Tyler Mahle is $8,800. David Peterson is $85,000. Then we have Ian Anderson, Jacob Junis, and Michael Wacha as the others at $7,000 or higher. And it's a rough slate for sure. Savali is the highest salaried guy. I'm confused about why, personally. I kind of get it because he's a good pitcher, but he's not a great DFS arm because of the lack of strikeouts. We'll talk about him in things to watch. My favorite guy for tonight is actually Tyler Mahle, and it might look like Mahle is bound for some regression because he has a 2.57 ERA. and he has a very, very large strikeout rate over a small sample. But I think it's pretty legit, and I'm inclined to buy in for this matchup against Arizona. Now, Arizona helps a lot because although they're not a high strikeout team, they're pretty rough. They have just an 89 WRC plus against righties. That is based on their current active roster since the start of last year. So even if it's a low strikeout matchup, it is a plushy spot for Mahle, and Mahle can take advantage of that. You can look at his good numbers this year. That's totally fine. A 3-start sample, if you're looking at the right numbers, that's good. But you can also look at last year. If you're skeptical of this year, look back to last year. We didn't really notice what he was doing last year because it was a smaller sample, kind of distracted by some of his teammates who were pitching really well too. But Mahle was good. He had a 30% strikeout rate, a 13.8% swinging strike rate, and that said that 30% strikeout rate was pretty legit. Now you're taking that version of Mahle and actually increasing his four-seam fastball velocity 1.2 miles per hour. So do I think his strikeout rate will stay 39%? Probably not. But even if it does go back down to last year's levels at 30%, he's still a very worthwhile option, especially on a slate that's lacking a lot of high-end guys. Mahle is still walking too many batters. That's an actual problem. It does help the Diamondbacks are not a huge walk team. We've seen Mahle go 84, 92, and 89 pitches in 3 starts. Not too concerned that he hasn't gone more than 5 innings. The pitch count is there. We just need to be a bit more efficient with his pitches. That might not happen, and that's why he's $8,800. That's why, he's not like, oh, yes, you must use Tyler Mahle as your top pitcher for tonight. But he could be more efficient, so I will go at Mahle here and see what happens. I think he's worthy of some optimism on a non-elite pitching slate. So Tyler Mahle, my number 1 starter for tonight. If I were just picking like the most quote-unquote talented pitcher on this slate, that's likely Ian Anderson. The problem is that he's facing the Yankees. We can talk about the Yankees and what they've been doing, but it's still a tough lineup. I am willing to use Anderson, but I personally am pretty willing to use pitchers in tough spots. So proceed with caution if that's not your process. Like if you only go at easy matchups, I don't view the Yankees as being that as of right now. There is enough here, though, when I consider everything, to rank Anderson second behind Mahle. The big plus for Anderson is that he does get strikeouts, kind of like Mahle. He had a 30% strikeout rate last year. It's 28% this year. And the repertoire for Anderson looks very similar for this year, both from a velocity perspective and a usage perspective, which means we can lump it all together. We've actually got a pretty large sample on Anderson. It's up to 9 starts now, and he has a 3.75 skill interactive ERA. His strikeout rate is 29%. And the plus of Anderson is that he's a good batted ball guy. He has allowed just a 4.9% barrel rate. His ground ball rate is 52%. And you don't get barrels out of ground balls. So that's why the barrel rate likely to stay low for Anderson. It wasn't as high in the minors as ground ball rate, but 9 starts is not a small sample anymore, and it's sticking so far. So I would not count it out. Now, again, the matchup, I don't deem it to be easy, despite the Yankees' struggles this year. They still have a 118 WRC plus versus righties since the start of last year, which means that Anderson has to face a DH again, too. So that's concerning. The 22% strikeout rate for the Yankees, right about average. So if this were a bigger slate, I would likely shove Anderson lower on my list because I do still think this is a difficult spot. And this matchup is tough enough to justify that, and it's tough enough for me to put him behind Mahle. But there just aren't a ton of great options on this slate. So I'm going to keep Anderson second, even though the matchup here, to me, is very tough with the Yankees. So Mahle 1, Anderson 2, as far as the top-end pitchers for today. And Anderson's salary is $7,800. That is nothing that'll put you back. Mahle's 88, so no matter where you go at pitcher, you're going to be spending very minimal salary for today. The third pitcher is, some people do not like using small samples. As you know, I do like using small samples if I have a reason to believe they're kind of legit. For Jacob Junis, it is very early to tell if his numbers will stick because they might not. He has basically made 1.5 starts so far this year, but what he's done in those 2 starts is very interesting. As always, I'd rather be too early on something than too late in MLB DFS because we're not going to have an advantage over the crowd if we're always, tailing. But I think that there is enough here to consider Junis at $7,300. Again, this is a very risky option. If you don't like risk, go Mahle or Anderson. And I think that they're better plays regardless. But I think that there is some incentive here to check out Junis. Part of the reason I'm okay with Junis here is the matchup. He's facing the Rays, who strike out a ton. They have a 26% strikeout rate versus righties, which is the second highest mark on the slate. So they can make hard contact, but those strikeouts do move the needle a lot for us from a pitching perspective. Junis' first two starts been very interesting. Last year, he was a slider guy. And this year, that pitch, if you go to Baseball Savant, is being classified as a cutter. And the reason that it's being classified as a cutter instead of a slider is because he's throwing it a lot harder. And it's working out really well, too. He's getting a 56% whiff rate on that pitch. His slider last year was a 26% whiff rate. So this is a pretty big shift. And it's led to two really good outings. Now, one of them was versus Cleveland. They're bad. They're a low strikeout team, but they're bad. The second start for Junis was against the Blue Jays. They're actually pretty good. In that game, he had a 12.3% swinging strike rate. It was 12.1% against Cleveland. So this could go terribly. Just proceed with caution. I think that a lot of you listening to this may not want to go Junis just because, it is a small sample, and our sample on him is not as a high strikeout pitcher, 17% strikeout rate last year, 6.39 ERA. The floor here is negative points. I just want to make that abundantly clear. Against the Rays, that could happen. But I think there is enough to justify using him. And for my personal process, if I am telling you what I'm going to do for tonight, I'm going to have some Jacob Junis just because I think that it's worthwhile to do so. Don't expect him to be super popular, so we'll give it a shot. We'll see what happens. I am very okay with risk, though. If you are not, do not use Junis. Focus just on Nally and Anderson. Also, if you don't like risk, this is potentially not the DFS sport for you and potentially not the slate for you just because it's brimming with risk across the board. Now, because there are so many cold temperatures on this slate for stacking, we don't have to care as much about the low temperatures. I do care still, specifically the outlier ones like the Cubs game and the White Sox game. But I do think that there is enough where I can feel okay with the Yankees game in the high 40s, low 50s and stack the Braves against Corey Kluber. And Kluber's velocity has risen as the season has gone along. It's gone up in all three of his starts. It's now back to where it was in 2019. That's the good for Kluber. The bad is that even 2019 wasn't great, and the early returns this year aren't either. Back in 2019, Kluber had a 4.68 skill interactive ERA. The results were actually a bit worse than that. He allowed an 8.9% barrel rate. This year, his skill interactive ERA is 4.59, very similar to then. His ERA is 6.10. Kind of looks like the same thing. He has allowed a 15.6% barrel rate this year. He did have a start against the Rays in there too. They're normally a strikeout booster, but Kluber got bounced in the third inning of that one. So you would think that having the Rays in there would give Kluber an elevated strikeout rate. That's not the case. Now he's facing the Braves, and that's the toughest matchup he's had this year because they have a 123 WRC plus against righties with a 36% hard hit rate. And both those numbers, the WRC plus and hard hit rate, are the highest numbers on this slate. Their 38% fly ball rate also ranks second. The only real annoyance for me with stacking against Kluber is that he is walking a lot of guys right now, which means fewer balls in play. And I'd rather that walk rate be lower. But with all the other factors pointing towards stacking against him, I do still think the Braves are a standout play here. So I think the Braves, the number one stack for today against Corey Kluber. Not great weather in New York, but I think that game should play. And there's not great weather elsewhere, so we'll still go with it. We don't talk about Travis d'Arnaud very much here on the podcast because using a catcher is not a necessity on FanDuel, but I think he makes it worthwhile. You can put him in there with Freddie Freeman and one of them at your utility slot. I think that's worth it. Since the start of last year, d'Arnaud has a 43% hard hit rate against righties with a 35% fly ball rate. His ISO is 243. He has a 13.2% barrel rate overall this year. So d'Arnaud is striking out more than you would like. I'm just not as concerned about that against Corey Kluber as I would be against others. So I think d'Arnaud is worthy of being a focal point in stacks at $2,900. I think that, you don't need to use a D8 or a catcher on FanDuel. I think I will for today just because the appeal in him is so high. And I think that he'll be one of the guys I go to on the Braves, despite the fact I don't need salary savings with this slate being as gross as it is. Now, I mentioned a couple times in the podcast that I think Merrill Kelly's a decent pitcher. He can do some stuff pretty well. But I'm inclined to stack against him in DFS once again. That strategy has worked out so far. He has an 8.44 ERA in those three starts, and the lone concerns we had about stacking against Kelly initially are becoming less concerning. So I think we have to keep going against him until he gives us a reason not to. If we look back to last year, the 5 starts for Kelly, he had a 23% strikeout rate. His walk rate was 4%, which meant that he was letting up a lot of balls in play. Now the strikeout rate is down to 14%. And that likely will increase because his swinging strike rate is 8.9%, but that still converts to roughly an 18% strikeout rate, and even that's low. And it means that he'll likely be letting up a ball in play about 77% of the time. That's a really big number. And we still see Kelly letting up a lot of barrels. It was 11.1% last year, 11.7% this year. So Kelly letting up balls in play. He's let up even more in the small sample this year, and tons of them are hard struck. And he doesn't get a break here because he's facing the Reds. And the Reds' big flaws in offense is strikeouts. They hit the ball really hard. So if you can't get strikeouts against them, you're probably going to have a rough day. I am expecting the struggles to continue for Kelly. That means stacking the Reds here, seeing if Kelly makes any changes to curtail the hard contact. But I think that for right now, we're good to stack against him still. Again, the lineup probably going to come out pretty late for this Reds team, given they're finishing that other game first. So you kind of have to be okay with that. But you can generally guess pretty well who will play and who will not. So I think we should be okay to fill out lineups here, and we can always scramble after the fact if we must. All the talk around the Reds this year is revolved around Tyler Naquin, but I want to talk about Jesse Winker. He is, I believe, the highest salaried Red for today, so it's not like outrageous to be high on Jesse Winker, but I think he's worth that salary. His barrel rate is 16.7% this year. His ground ball rate is down to 37%. So we talk a lot about Vlad Guerrero Jr. Increasing his or decreasing his ground ball rate. That's very true, and Vlad's been awesome, but Winker's kind of doing the same, and he just doesn't have the homers to show for it yet. I think those home runs will come for Winker. So even though he's pretty high salaried at $3,700, I'm going to use Winker a lot. Salary is not really an issue on this slate. So I think that we can go here, feel pretty good about it, and see what happens. I will use Naquin too if he's in there. But I just want to mention, explicitly that I think that Jesse Winker is worth that salary and someone who we should use in DFS for today. For the final stack, I mentioned before that the weather in Boston is super gross, so that game is a risk of a rainout, and that's still true. So make sure you check the status of this game later on. But if it plays, I like the Blue Jays quite a bit. They're facing Garrett Richards, and Richards used to be a guy who got strikeouts and got ground balls, which is the exact opposite of what we want for stacking. Right now, he's not getting either of those. In his first 3 starts, he has a 9.2% swinging strike rate with a 41% ground ball rate. And we saw signs of this last year, too. The ground ball rate for Richards was down to 40%. His strikeout rate was 22%. And that was despite having a couple of appearances as a reliever, which tends to boost strikeout rate. He had a 26% strikeout rate in the bullpen, 21% as a starter. He finished that year with a 4.55 skill interactive ERA and a 4.03 ERA. Now he goes to Boston, tough park to pitch in. It does seem like his skills may have eroded even a bit more because his fastball velocity is down a full mile per hour. I don't think the early struggles for Richards are the result of a small sample. He's facing the Blue Jays here. They're really good offense with a 110 WRC plus against righties and a 39% fly ball rate. So you got to make sure the game plays. Make sure you're being cognizant of that. But I do like this spot quite a bit. With pitching being as low salaried as it is, you can get to Vlad Guerrero Jr. easily. There's no decision there. You just kind of lock him in. I think he's legit. We talked about this a couple of times in the podcast. I'm buying high. Don't care. Fully in. Bo Bichette looks like a legit stud. Marcus Semion's hitting for power. Kevin Biggio's hitting for power. So I think you just take the 4 best guys here. That could include Randall Grichuk. He has not had the best results against righties yet, but the peripherals are there for it to happen. So I say you just take your 4 favorite Jays. Those 5 are the ones who stand out to me, but take your 4 favorite Jays. You can afford them for today. They're in a good spot against Richards. The weather there, if it plays, is pretty good because the temperature is so high, relative to others. So I do think it grades out pretty well. Let's finish up with things to watch. And I do want to discuss why I'm not as high on Aaron Savali, given that he is the highest salaried pitcher on this slate. He is facing the White Sox, which is not a bad matchup, but it's also not a good one. It's mostly here that I don't view Savali as being a great DFS option because his strikeout rate is not that high. He had a 22% strikeout rate last year. He's at 22% this year, and that's with a decreased swinging strike rate, so it could come down even more. He does a good job in other places. Like, he's not a bad pitcher. He's just not one I want to use when I have higher upside options elsewhere for DFS. I I can say with a good amount of certainty that the full season strikeout rate for Tyler Mahle and Ian Anderson will be much higher than Aaron Savali. So I'd rather take chances on them. Jacob Junis, maybe not, but I think I can say that for the other guys. So I'm okay passing over Savali for today, even though he is the highest salaried pitcher on the slate. The Mets are in a really rough weather situation, but I think you can give some thought to stacking them. They're facing Zach Davies, who was awesome last year, but his velocity is down a bit this year, and he's throwing more sinkers, which I'm never a fan of, as you know. I don't think he'll have a 6.10 skill interactive ERA for the full season. That's actually his number so far through 3 starts. The walk rate will probably come down, and that'll help, but when you're struggling against the Pirates, against whom he has started twice, it's a pretty big red flag. So I think the Mets make sense here. They're not a priority stack by any means because the temperature is so low, but they do work, and I will use them for today. Finally, I do think the Red Sox work for stacks if that game plays. Trent Thornton is starting for the Jays, but it sounds like he'll be an opener, and then Anthony Kay or Tommy Malone will be the long boy out of the bullpen. Thornton, not a big strikeout guy, so no issue that he's going to be the opener here. Neither are Kay or Malone. So I would treat the Red Sox as if they're facing a lefty, given both Kay and Malone are lefties. So Xander Bogaerts gets a boost from me as a result of that at $3,000. A lot of the guys at the top of the lineup are righties, like Kike Hernandez is a righty. So, account for that for sure, that they're probably going to face a righty the first time through. But overall, I do think that the Red Sox, an option for today for sure, whether it's Thornton, Kay, or Malone, who is facing them. That is all that we have for today. Again, a lot of question marks on this slate, especially for the weather. So make sure you come back 4 p.m. Eastern today, and we'll chat about the weather, chat about any changes that I've made based on additional research, et cetera, et cetera. 4 p.m. today, ask me questions about people I didn't discuss, stacks I didn't discuss, whatever it may be. Feel free to hit me up, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, and Facebook to get those questions in at 4 p.m. Eastern every day. Lots of good stuff here on the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed as well. In addition to MLB, we have NBA and NHL from Tom Vecchio. We have UFC with Austin Swaim. I'm doing NASCAR on Friday, talking Talladega. So make sure you are subscribed to the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed. And if you like what you hear, or if we help you win some money, make sure you leave a rating and review as well. If you have questions for me, I am on Twitter at Jim Sannes, JimSannes. You can also follow the FanDuel Podcast Network at FanDuel Podcast. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald for setting up this video stream for today. Thank you, Cal, as always. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Good luck to you with your MLB DFS lineups for today. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow. This has been the Solo Shot right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network.